I was buying some cat toys at Centinela Feed on Ventura Boulevard in Encino, California, where all the men are wealthy, all the women are beautiful, and all the children are above average. In the parking lot was this guy, Charles. I talked about Charles before. He's just more of an acquaintance than a friend. He said, "Do you have a couple of minutes?" And I said, "Oh, yeah, sure," when I meant not really. At any rate, we went down Ventura Boulevard to this wonderful pub called the Surly Goat. Have I talked about that before? And in front it says, "Warm beer, cold women." And Charles kind of chuckled at that, and I figured, oh boy, he's going to talk about his sex life. Here I am wanting to go back to do my podcast. So we sat down, and he ordered a martini. Wow, a martini, and 3 o'clock in the afternoon, or actually it's more like 2:30. And I had a Pilsner Urquell because I thought I want to go back and do my podcast. But there's Charles, and he wants to have a conversation with me, so I said, okay. And he said, "Remember that woman Leslie?" And I said, oh my God. I mean, internally I said to myself, oh my God, he's going to talk about Leslie again. What's going to happen to the rest of my day? And I said, oh sure, Leslie. She's this woman you had a mad crush on. And he said, crush? Men don't have crushes on people. What are you talking about? And I said, sure they do. It's men who develop that kind of, let's call it a fixation, and more than women do. And it's often men who, I don't know, they're not getting a lot, you know what I mean? And he said, well, call it what you like, but there was Leslie, and you remember I spent all this time with Leslie, and every time she had a problem or an issue in her life, she calls Charles, and Charles always comes over or talks to her on the phone or answers her texts or emails or all the stuff that she wants or needs. And it was either real estate or her car or her neighbors or her travel plans or the whole gamut of things. Charles went on and on about this, and I went on and on about this, saying, oh yeah, but ultimately wasn't really interesting. And Charles said, well, she even talked to me about these guys she met that she wanted to somehow get to pay attention to her. And I said again internally, uh-oh, that's a telltale sign of a woman that doesn't want anything to do with you on a romantic or like sleeping with or dating, they call it. I keep trying to figure out what dating means, by the way. We've talked about this before. I mean, for me, dating means, well, you go out and you have a nice meal and get her drunk and you go somewhere and you do the nasty. And for women, it still means something like, going and having a cup of coffee at Starbucks and her telling you about all of her problems and all the issues in her life and the hard time she's having at work and all that kind of stuff. So men and women have very different ideas what it means when you talk about dating. Anyway, here's Charles talking again, and he said, well, even some of her friends got the idea that we were an item. And I again said to myself, well, that doesn't mean anything. I think you're projecting on her friends and what they think. Charles again, well, we were at this party, and she kept asking for another glass of wine, and we spent the whole evening talking as if, wow, it's like we were, something was going on. So we got real drunk because there was only wine and not a whole heck of a lot of food, and suddenly everyone was saying goodbye. And he said, well, you know what I did? And I kind of guessed what he did, but he told me anyway. He hugged Leslie, and in the course of doing so, he managed to nuzzle her a little bit, and somehow his lips touched her neck. Uh-oh, I said to myself, a phrase my German mechanic always uses. Uh-oh. And but I said it aloud this time. Uh-oh. At that point, Charles said, I kind of lost track of what was going on. I think I said, I love you, or some words to that effect. And, Leslie hasn't spoken with me since. I scratched my head, figuratively, at that moment. And started thinking about things just for 30 seconds, and I said, and I said, liquid. You know, Charles, I know you're so busy having sex that you don't have time to listen to my podcast. And he kind of chuckled, having, as if to say, having sex? Who, me? And I said, there are a couple of episodes you should really listen to. One is an fairly early episode on the subject of attraction, which you should really listen to. And then there's another episode that basically says women do the choosing. Men think that they're the ones who do the choosing, but it's actually women who do the choosing. So always bear that in mind. And one basis on which women do the choosing is they want men with long penises. And Charles is standing there saying, well, we never sort of did anything, that is to say Leslie and me. And I said, let me just continue for a second. It's evolution, because men with long penises are better physically, more adaptive, etc. In every way, they're superior, and evolution says we're choosing for the survival of the fittest. We're choosing to benefit the species, and a less fit, less healthy man is not something that you want to keep in the gene pool. You want to improve the species. And Charles was kind of looking at me with that blank stare and say, well, what does this have to do with me? And all of a sudden I invented a new concept, brand new, which I called the helper syndrome. And I said, okay, Charles, I've just invented a new idea. Maybe I'll talk about it on a podcast. I call it the helper syndrome. And that is to say that women, attractive women in particular, and even not so attractive women, want male helpers in their life, particularly if they're not married, but occasionally even if they are married, because it's just how things worked out. Women can be very strong and very intelligent, obviously, and have as good or better qualities than men. But the way things have worked out historically, women really like to have men running their errands for them and fixing things for them and giving them advice and all the sort of things that you were giving Leslie advice on, because that's just how it is. But the problem is that the guy on the other side of the equation starts thinking, well, she really likes me. At the end of the day, she's going to fall into my arms. It may take forever. It may only happen when we're 80 years old, but at the end of the day, she's going to fall into my arms, and we're going to live happily ever after. And I sort of filled in my mind, yeah, it's two old codgers in a nursing home. Oh, boy, does that sound, basically unappealing, like really unappealing. And then I said, you keep thinking from your perspective. Start thinking from Leslie's perspective. Start looking at, considering, thinking about how she sees you, how she sees the world. She, yeah, well, kind of. And Charles then sort of threw something in. He said, we had a conversation once, Leslie and I, and the gist of the conversation was I was trying to convince her that we had once gone on a date. We'd agreed to go to movies at some theater or other, and we sat through the movies, and she was really moved by the movie, etc. So I said, hey, Leslie, we actually did go on a date once. And Leslie said, I never went on a date with you. Again, my mechanic speaks inside my head. Uh-oh. Sure sign of the fact that Leslie ain't into you, baby. There are lots of other stories like this about what I've just invented, the helper syndrome. Nothing wrong with it. If you, as a man, are content with that, if it makes you happy, that's okay. But if you want to get laid, okay, let's get down to brass tacks here, or if you want what they call a relationship, and man, oh man, that's a whole other kettle of worms, whatever they call it. a relationship, then you better be wary of this, because you're spending a lot of time in a situation where that ain't gonna happen. Just advice to men in general. Be wary. Be careful. Yes, 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 we as men enjoy women's company. It's the other side of the equation, so to speak. I'm actually not one of those people, like so many other people are, who say, well, men have both a male and female side and inside themselves. Well, to me, that's a lot of malarkey. For the average, like cis male, they call it, straight male, as they used to call it, heterosexual male, to use the more technical term. Cis male, straight male, heterosexual male are male, and they have male interests and desires, but on the other hand, they really enjoy the company of women because, as I said a moment ago, that's the other side of the equation for them. And it's really nice if there's a real situation where the two are, for example, speaking intellectually about something. And it's really interesting to hear the woman respond to that, not only respond to that, but come up with her own concepts and throw them at you as a guy. And that, you scratch your head. You keep scratching your head. We're going to not have any hair by the end of this episode. You scratch your head and you say, oh yeah, that's a whole other way of looking at things. I never would have thought of that. Well, you never would have thought of that because you're a guy. You're a cis male, etc., etc., etc. That's not the kind of thing you would think about. And this becomes an amazingly interesting conversation and interaction and mental collaboration. And there should be more of these in general. One thinks of Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir. Well, that was kind of a different thing entirely. There should be a lot more of this going on in our society. And it is wonderful when you can combine this sort of, we're going to call it intellectual, for lack of a better word, even psychological, even in a certain way psychic collaboration between men and women, which is everything. It's sensual, it's emotional, it's physical, it's sexual, it's intellectual, it's psychic. Did I say that before? It's all of these things that you would want in what they call a relationship. I'm getting to really hate that word because people start talking about relationships all the time, and it becomes kind of a drag. It's like, two people are dating, quote unquote, or they're sleeping together, quote unquote, and they're wondering, oh, are we in a relationship yet? Does that mean we got to get married? Does that mean we got to talk about breaking up? Does that mean that one or the other of us is going to cheat? Because after all, that's what happens when people are in a relationship. It becomes kind of this big deal of obligations, and becomes this kind of big deal of paranoia about, is it going to end, or is someone going to cheat, as I said a moment ago, or are people going to come along and say, are you married yet? And whether they're relatives or friends or whoever, they say they're getting ready for the big day. Who's going to catch the bouquet? Who's going to have a dance with a bride, and all this kind of malarkey? So that relationship thing puts a lot of pressure on both the men and the women. Pressure of expectations, pressure of obligations, as I said a moment ago. But that's just an aside. But the important thing for guys out there is to think about what they want in a situation with a woman. Do they want to date? Do they want to sleep together? Do they want to be a helper? How is the woman on the other side of the equation defining you? Because women do that. Women define you in their minds, and they're going to stick to that. They're going to hold to that. Nothing's going to change in that. It's just going to be how it is. This is not a problem, he says, in a very unctuous tone. This is not a problem as long as you know where you're at. So back to Charles. And Charles, didn't really take away very much from what I told him. And I said to myself, self, Charles is just going to continue with this pattern for a very, very long time. And as I mentioned a moment ago, maybe when he's 80 years old, there'll be some woman there, and they're going to, have a little wedding ceremony in the old person's home. They're going to sit holding hands, watching TV on a couch, and that's going to be it. And they'll hold hands, which at that age is really, really sensual and sexy. Anyway, so, Charles, I should say, at the very beginning of the conversation said, well, I have a lot of anxiety because I'm just about to turn 39. That's the stage of life Charles is in. And I said, well, I got even more anxiety. I'm just about to turn 40. And it's kind of unbelievable when you're in high school or college or in your 20s. You don't even think about what it's like to be 40. But here we're, both facing it. And you are facing it because, yeah, I know you've had little girlfriend situations, and yeah, you've had some sex along the way. Maybe it hasn't been all that great. I'm just saying that to myself. I didn't say it to him. But here you are. What do you want? My advice to guys, always, whether they're 15 or 18 or 20 or 30 or 40 or 50, God, can you imagine? My 50th birthday is something I really don't look forward to, is to make money. Make money. But that's kind of an interesting, weird situation because women are still going to choose on the basis of the other things that we talked about before, and of course they're going to want to have eye candy. The expression eye candy is used about men. They think that they have some buxom blonde in their arm, and they're thinking, oh, she's eye candy. But women go after eye candy too. They want to be, looked up to because they're with a guy who fits the current media projection of what a handsome, sexy guy is. Back to the same old thing. Women do the choosing. So that's a situation that can be remedied for a guy by one thing. Get rich. Make money. Forget about everything else. And if you're not going to have a woman who wants to marry you, and as they used to say, walk down the aisle with you, da 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 dum 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 dum, all that kind of nonsense, at least you'll have someone to do the nasty with. And at the end of the day, that's a really nice thing. By the time I was finished with Charles, it was, how late? It was 6 o'clock. I'd had more than one Pilsner Urquell's, and just to sort of keep up with him, as it were. And for some reason I didn't feel like going back home. I didn't feel like working. So I got in my car and started driving west. What happens when you drive west from Encino, California? Ultimately, you reach the ocean. To you I bring my great eternal sorrow. Someone once wrote about the ocean, but was that what I was doing? It wasn't exactly clear to me. And I found myself paying my $5 and going into the pay lot and walking along, what do you call that? It's not the boardwalk. It's the sandy little thing that leads you along the beach with restaurants and whatnot on the left and the ocean on the right. And I found myself at a place I'd been to before called the Fig Tree Cafe, which is not a particularly outstanding place to go, but that's where I found myself anyway. The waiter seated me, and there I was. I was thinking about a Bloody Mary for whatever reason. I sort of knew, but sort of didn't, but no such thing. So I ordered myself a glass of red wine, which turned out to be more like pink wine. It was more like a rosé. It was actually pretty awful. And I just sat there, and eventually I ordered something. Even now, a couple of hours later, I have no idea what I ordered. I just kind of sat there. On one side, there was a jazz combo, if you want to call it that. I guess that's what they do call it. It was a drummer, a guitarist, and a guy playing the electric piano, and I realized this was the same sort of sound that jazz combos played 20 years ago when I was in college. It hasn't changed a thing. The style hasn't changed a thing. Not at all. Here I am. Next year I'll be 40. And these other generations sort of had a voice in music and various other things. Mine didn't. I can't think of a single singer or vocalist that I identified with at all. There were the rappers, but this was sort of not for me. There were the, black pop singers, Beyonce, and there were a couple of others, and they didn't seem to say anything to me. There was a new singer, what was her name, Taylor something, coming up, and goodness heavens, she wasn't about me or my generation at all. It didn't bother me in a certain way, and yet it did. Someone I knew, who was a little bit younger than myself, was a big fan of the Beatles. And the Beatles sounded to me as if it could just as well have been music recorded in the 1940s or 1930s. It sounded so old. It sounded so out of date. It sounded dead. And there was one lyric that this woman I knew would always sing along to. Oh, that magic feeling, nowhere to go. Oh, that magic feeling, nowhere to go. I looked over at the people walking on that stretch, that walkway between the restaurant I was at and the Pacific Ocean. Of course, I looked at women. What else is there to look at in this life but women? None of them had any appeal to me. They weren't beautiful. They didn't look interesting, whatever that means. They didn't look like anything. And maybe this was because I was just the wrong age. I was 39 years old. I am 39 years old. A strange age to be at. Thinking that women my age, a lot of them are divorced. You go on these things, what do they call it, TikTok, and a woman sits there and does a video, and she says, "Hi, I'm 28 years old and I'm divorced," or "Hi, I'm 35 years old and I'm divorced," or "Hi, I'm 55 years old and I'm divorced. Where are you? Are you in Nebraska? That's where I am, and I really want to get out of Nebraska," and all this sort of stuff. And I look at this stuff for about 6 or 7 minutes every once in a while, and I go, oh man, all these divorced people. What happened to them? Was there cheating? But that's not very interesting. I was just feeling detached. Suddenly I felt my sexuality gone away. I realized that there was something that I had been repressing. as in the return of the repressed, was something I'd been repressing ever since I first encountered Charles in the parking lot outside of Sentinella Feed on Ventura Boulevard in Encino, California, where there are 15 day spas and 5 Mercedes-Benz dealerships. That sort of place, where all the men are wealthy and all of the women are beautiful and all of the children are above average. And what I had been repressing, as now I'm driving along, going essentially nowhere, was that here I was, in effect, putting Charles down, and Charles in his predicament with Leslie, the helper syndrome, as I've been calling it, in this podcast episode, this bonus podcast episode. And what I had been repressing and avoiding in my mind was that I myself had been in that helper syndrome role more than once. It was a pattern for me, just as it was, perhaps, for Charles. I thought of the women who had come to me wanting help finding jobs, and women who had come to me asking for help with their movie projects and their scripts, and the woman who had come to me asking for help to get into college, and then, continuing that help once she finally got in. Until one morning she sat me down and she said the inevitable, "We need to talk." And that conversation, lasting 4 minutes and 15 seconds, ended with her saying, "No woman would ever find you acceptable." Yeah, that was my attempt at a love life. I think overall I was doing about the same as Charles, or maybe a little bit worse. Then I looked over, and I've been sort of avoiding looking at her, but there was a blonde. She was pretty well dressed. It looked like she was ready for something. I didn't know if she was waiting for somebody or was just there to have a nice evening at this questionable restaurant. She moved from one side of the table to the other and then back again, fidgeting a little bit. And I said, "Well, what's going on?" And I don't think she was drinking anything at all. Maybe just water and nothing, but she sat there and she sat there. And eventually, after a long, long time, there was this bearded character, and I couldn't tell if he was Middle Eastern or Hispanic or maybe partly Asian. I don't know what he was. And he had sort of slightly ripped jeans, just like deliberately slightly ripped jeans, perhaps. As soon as he arrived, he began to speak. I only caught a few words of what he had to say. Am I imagining things, or did the word corporate occur once or twice? And I kept looking at the woman, even though I only saw her back, and I said to myself, when she's asleep, she looks like an angel. When she's asleep, she looks like an angel. All the time these two people were sitting there, she did not say a bleeping word. He was holding forth. And it seemed rather odd. And then I thought back, wait a minute, these people are on a date. And it all became clear to me, this is a date. This is what happens in a date. What's going to happen to them after this? Well, they must have arrived in 2 separate vehicles, logically. But it's not worth speculating about. It was just a date that I was witnessing or observing. And to repeat, she didn't say a bleeping word. Curious thing. Elsewhere at another table, actually at several different tables because they kept moving around, there was a woman with a foreign accent, I couldn't tell what, and she was accompanied by this older guy. At a certain age, people are just classified as older. I don't know what age he was, in his 60s. And it was scary just to look at this guy. I wonder what will happen when people look at me and all they see is an older guy. Should be happy to have some woman there with him because he's just old. He's just old. As I said, the two people got up and left. I had a second glass of rather questionable wine. I always choose the French wine on the menu, and that's not always the thing to do. Take my word for it. And I wandered away. Before too long, I was driving faster than is my wont. I was driving north on the world-famous 405 freeway across the world-famous Sepulveda Pass. It went through my mind, where should I pull off? Should I just keep going? Just driving fast, driving along the freeway, the highway, the interstate, as I think they used to call them. Thinking to myself about the events of the day. When I was sitting in the restaurant looking at the people walking back and forth, again, not interesting, not attractive, for half a second I thought I saw Leslie. And that would have been weird. Hi, Leslie, I'm Charles' friend. But didn't strike me as something that I should have done or would have done, and she wasn't there anyway. He was just sort of blank people. So here I am, the world-famous podcaster, and thinking about my upcoming episodes and my past episodes, and what to tell people. What do people want to hear? What is good for people? I don't give a goddamn what's good for people. It's more like what I feel like saying, and hopefully someone will get something out of it eventually. So I made my way home, wherever home is. It's sometimes not that obvious. And my microphone was still on my desk. I turned it on. I turned the recording program on. And I figured that was it for today. But once again I thought of the blonde woman, and those words came back to my mind. When she's asleep, she looks like an angel.